Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the Preventing Violence, Saving Lives, What Works for Reducing Homicides and Conflict-Related Deaths. A really important piece of work. Welcome to this launch of the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition's Peace Pillar Synthesis. Really happy to have you here. And really happy to be presenting this work that is a culmination of a long time, I think at least a year's worth of dedicated effort by many people and organizations who have contributed to this. So without further ado, I'll introduce myself. My name is Isabelle Mercier. I am the Director of the Independent Evaluation Office at UNDP, and I am also the Chair of the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition. And I am joined today by a fantastic panel who you will be hearing from very shortly. And I'll do short introductions. We have Thomas de Hoop, who's the managing economist for the American Institutes for Research. Andy Coombs, principal qualitative researcher at the American Institutes for Research as well. And this is the team who's done the heavy lifting on the synthesis report. Matthew Cogan, from the Deputy Director, Peace and Stability Unit of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade from Ireland. Fatou Jah, Chief Peace Recovery and Solutions Division for IOM. Ana Yancy Lopez, the Head of Pillar, Human Rights, Civil Affairs, Guidance and Learning, Department of Peace Operations. And finally, Brian James Williams, Chief UN Peacebuilding Fund. So very excited that this panel has been able to join us in this very important launch event. So I'll explain a little bit where this work comes from. Next slide, please. So I'll talk about the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition. Now, the purpose of this coalition, the goal, the mission, is to harness the power of evaluation and synthesis to accelerate the achievement of the 2030 Agenda. And this coalition was born in 2022 out of this desire to harness the power of evaluative evidence that we knew existed and that was underused, and to put it to work towards informing us about what works in what contexts when it comes to SDG achievement. Just to give you a sense of the evaluative databases that we have that we felt were underused. We have over 7,000 now evaluations in the UNDP IEO database, and over 14,000 evaluations produced by the UN system in total. And synthesis gives us the opportunity to look across that evaluative base and get insights that you can't by looking at just one simple report. So the idea of the coalition was to use that and to make sense of that evidence, because we knew that there was something to be learned from it. What we've done is we've pulled together a group that has been working for a few years to produce synthesis, but more than that, to fulfill this ambition to use the evidence that we do have. Next slide, please. So I'll give you a sense of how we're structured. We have a leadership group, which I chair, and we are supported by a secretariat. The leadership group is myself, but also very important colleagues that will work very collectively in leading this organization. We have a representative from ESIC, someone from the Asian Development Bank, Campbell Collaboration, UN SDG System-Wide Evaluation Office, and the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean are part of this leadership group that has guided the coalition over the past few years. The way we deliver on our work is via management groups in each of the 5 pillars. So the pillars of the SDGs are partnerships, people, planet, prosperity, and peace. And we have organized ourselves around these 5 pillars. Within this whole group, when you think about the totality of the people involved in the coalition, we're talking about over 45 multilateral entities working together to identify priorities, needs, and possible synthesis, and also execute syntheses on each of these pillars. And today, of course, we are talking about the most recent work that we have done on the Peace Pillar Management Group. So to give you a sense of who was involved in this work, next slide, please. We have, this was co-led by UNODC, OIOS, PBSO, UNFPA, and UNDP. We're joined by several of the representatives today. Donors were UNDP IEOS, my office, UNFPA, Spain, and Ireland. And you can see here that there's representation and there was work together to pull together the prioritization of the Peace Pillar synthesis, and of course, the execution of the work, which was done with Thomas and Andy and AIR. So what we've produced right now and what we'll be talking about is a suite of products that we're very proud of. We have, please pull the next slide, Daniel. A full synthesis report. It's on our website. We encourage you to have a look at it, of course, which is a comprehensive reference document for policymakers, evaluators, researchers, and practitioners. It's dense, but we do encourage you to look at it. For those of us who have a bit less time and just want the highlights, we have a 5-page brief. It's concise and actionable and gives you a good overview of the evidence that's come through in this synthesis. And also, very interesting work that was done for those of you who do synthesis. You know that evaluation gap or evidence gap maps are part of the process, but in and of itself, a very interesting product. We have an interactive map here, which tells you where the evidence is. Not just the evidence that was used for the synthesis, but where the evidence is in various cross-sectional areas of work so that you can delve into the evidence base yourself and have a look. So that is the overview, a little bit of the Peace Pillar. I do want to mention that the coalition continues to do its work, not just in this pillar, but in the other pillars, and has also very much benefited from advancements with the ESIC, the initiative, which allows us to have an even larger ambition, which is to really contribute to a living suite of syntheses that would be able to do this sort of work, but across all the pillars, and to have an AI-supported way to access the evaluative evidence available to us across all the pillars. So stay tuned for work going on in that. But right now, we'll return our focus to the Peace Pillar report. And I'll turn over to Thomas, who will talk about the results of that work. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And my name is Thomas de Hoop. I'm a managing economist at AIR and the principal investigator for this evidence synthesis. Just before I start, also want to acknowledge all the efforts from the rest of the team, both from American Institutes for Research as well as from Campbell South Asia. Not enough time to mention everyone, but thanks to everyone for their contributions. This was a team effort. So to start, I want to give you an overview of where we focused on. This evidence synthesis is the first evidence synthesis that was produced under the Peace Pillar of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. And we focused on a number of topics that we based on like a previous taxonomy that was produced by 3IE in another like similar or related evidence synthesis. And that evidence synthesis was done a few years ago, so like not fully up to date anymore. And in addition to that, we also felt that at this point it was time to conduct an evidence synthesis around this topic, because previous evidence synthesis have generally not considered evaluations from the UN system and from bilateral and multilateral donors in addition to impact evaluations. So the topics that we focused on, like first of all, were social inclusion, which focus on strengthening social cohesion and conflict resolution, safe environments, which focus on ending violence and building a safe and secure environments, and peace processes and conflict prevention. So supporting peace processes, oversight, and post-conflict justice. So as you can see, like these three categories like have a lot of different initiatives associated with them. But overall, we focus on those initiatives that have a direct goal to reduce or to improve peace and to like save lives. We're not necessarily including initiatives that can indirectly influence peace outcomes, for such as economic initiatives. We can go to the next slide. So in our synthesis, we examined a number of questions. The first is like what works and where. And for this question, we really focused on impact evaluations specifically, and we aim to address the question, what interventions are effective in reducing homicides and conflict-related deaths as our primary outcome measures. And we also examined how these impacts differed across different contexts to the extent possible. For example, by examining differences between low-income countries and middle-income countries, differences between conflict and non-conflict settings, acute crisis versus protracted crisis settings, etc. We also examined not only what works, but also how or why does it work. So I mentioned this earlier already, like we don't only include impact evaluations as part of this evidence synthesis, we also have a separate category for performance and process evaluations. When I talk about impact evaluations, I really talk about evaluations that ask the question, what would have happened in the absence of this intervention, so that we can address causal questions like what is the impact of this peace initiative on homicides and conflict-related deaths, whereas performance and process evaluations tend to focus more on implementation and why and how questions, like why are these interventions reducing conflict-related deaths and homicides, and how do these interventions achieve these objectives? And they also closely interact with contextual implementation and design factors to influence the effectiveness of these interventions. Finally, we're also like examining the interaction of these different evaluations with contextual characteristics that relate, for example, to gender and marginalization. So like how do gender and marginalization affect the impact of interventions to reduce conflict-related deaths and homicides? All of this we do to the extent possible, because ultimately like our evidence synthesis is dependent on the evidence that exists. For those of you who are less familiar with synthesis, we really try to have a comprehensive overview of existing evidence. We're not necessarily producing evidence here ourselves. And that makes it different from like an evaluation, but like the key strength of the evidence synthesis is really to have this comprehensive overview of high quality evidence globally. We can go to the next slide. So how do we do this essentially? Like what we do is like we do something slightly different for the impact evaluation evidence as for the performance and process evaluation evidence. For the impact evaluation evidence, we really look at primarily academic databases. We develop a search string and we apply that search string in different academic databases. And like those academic databases then give us a large number of studies, of which the large majority is not relevant for us, but through like both manual and machine learning or AI screening, we like make sure that we only include the studies in our evidence synthesis that are relevant to answer the research question. And you see here that we start essentially with over 10,000 studies. Of those, we exclude immediately 6,785 studies that we screen with a team to show that they are not relevant to address the research questions. And then another 3,066 studies were also screened out through machine learning or AI methods. Ultimately, we ended up with with 39 studies, and we also we coded those studies, and we also conducted a risk of bias assessment for those studies. For the performance and process evaluations, we used a similar but slightly distinct approach. The key difference here is really the types of databases that we examine. Like many of you will know that United Nations has many different types of evaluations that it commissions or conducts. Some of those are impact evaluations. Many more of them are performance and process evaluations. And for this, we looked at databases like by the United Nations, as well as like various bilateral donors, including some of the donors of the management group. And for that, we really started with about 3,000 records. And ultimately, we found that 438 of the performance and process evaluations were relevant to address the research questions. This also shows you like how much benefit there is to actually including some of the UN databases and the bilateral and databases from bilateral donors. A lot of evidence will not be included if you only focus on academic databases. Given time and resource constraints, we ultimately ended up analyzing 75 of the performance and process evaluations that were closely aligned with the topics in the impact evaluations to like make sure that we could maximize triangulation. We can go to the next slide. So based on this, we came up with like a number of lessons. I just want to, before I start discussing the lessons, highlight that we're giving you like an illustrative snapshot here of some of the lessons. Like many more lessons are presented in the brief, as well as in the report that can be found online. But I wanted to give you some highlights here during this presentation. So the first one is like a really like important, critical question, which is like, whether peace missions really work in reducing violence. And if you look at the evidence, for me, the evidence was actually surprisingly consistent in demonstrating that peace missions were consistently associated with reductions in civilian casualties. There are not many impact evaluations on this topic, but the impact evaluations that exist, almost all demonstrate that peace missions reduce like conflict-related deaths. Like just to give you an example, in sub-Saharan Africa, like one study demonstrated, this was an overall impact evaluation with a comparison group across many settings in sub-Saharan Africa, that an increase in 100 peacekeepers led to 3 fewer civilian casualties per month, while more specifically in East Darfur, land dispute reforms reduced local conflicts. We can go to the next slide. At a more micro level, like media and communication was also demonstrated to reduce violence in various studies. We found this was the topic where most impact evaluations were available. About 6 impact evaluations focused on media and communication initiatives. And like one study, for example, demonstrated that in Uganda, radio messages that tried to encourage Lord Resistance Army rebels to defect from the Lord Resistance Army, those radio messages reduced fatalities. And like this effect was particularly strong when there were labor market opportunities. We will come back to that later. But the same pattern was like quite consistent across settings again. One important thing that we found as well is that like the messenger matters here. Like trusted messengers seem to have like larger impacts on like violence reductions. For example, in Nigeria, we see that religious leader broadcasts improve attitudes towards reconciliation in particular. We can go to the next slide. I already mentioned that media and communication initiatives seem to like actually have larger impacts on reductions in violence when they were accompanied by economic opportunities. But this seemed to be something that happened across the board, not only in Uganda, but also in Rwanda and in various settings in Southeast Asia. And just to give you like a little bit of background, like on how this may happen, like Lord Resistance Army rebels in Uganda, to come back to the previous example, they were particularly likely to defect when cotton prices increased and when they actually had opportunities to work on cotton farming. Whereas if they worked in groundnut farming, groundnuts are much easier to loot for the Lord Resistance Army, so there were fewer opportunities when groundnut prices actually increased relative to cotton prices. In general, like we saw really that economic opportunity reinforced peace messaging and reintegration. Just to highlight like our inclusion criteria again, we didn't necessarily examine the impact of interventions like vocational and business training here, but this gives some indication on how such interventions may potentially also affect conflict-related deaths as well. So another important message here is that economics matters, and that peace messaging can actually have larger impacts under more favorable economic conditions. We can go to the next slides. And here I'm going to give the floor to Andy, who will give the rest of the presentation on behalf of the team.
Thanks, Thomas. So the first lesson that I'm presenting on the fact that combined interventions are linked to stronger peace outcomes. I think Thomas's slide where he just showed that peace building can be enhanced by livelihood and employment opportunities is the first example of that. We found across impact evaluations and performance and process evaluations that communications and public engagement can positively influence the success of other types of programs. So for example, social inclusion, when combined with safe environments or other conflict prevention efforts, are more useful than the first bullet here, infrastructure alone, for example. There was one evaluation of a reconstruction program in the DRC that focused solely on reconstruction. The idea was that it could change community attitudes towards the government. However, come to find out, the community did not necessarily associate the infrastructure improvements with the government, and therefore it didn't work. They did not combine it with any sort of community outreach or trust building. On the other hand, the initiative referenced here in Jordan that invested in trust building as well as infrastructure improvements and social cohesion was found to increase build trust and increase cooperation between Jordanian host and Syrian refugee populations when combined with good investments in schools, health centers, and other infrastructure improvements. I think this also ties again back to what Thomas talked about for the importance of communications to shape attitudes towards the types of improvements that programs are doing. If you can go to the next slide, please. We also found that policing reduced violence. However, it was a very particular type of policing, like community policing, whereas militarized approaches to policing increased risks. So what do we mean by rights-based scaled policing for reducing homicides and violent crime? We found that access to police paired with capacity building for these police groups, even in terms of very basic capacity building, helped to ensure that the police were interacting well with the community. And performance and process evaluations, in addition, underscored the value of, again, community engagement as a vehicle for improving the perception of legitimacy of the law enforcement. On the other hand, not surprisingly, we found through impact evaluations that military policing showed particularly concerning results, including increased human rights abuses and in some cases, increased crime. Also, again, relatedly, and it makes sense that there was then weakened community trust as a result of militarized policing. Again, these findings demonstrate the importance of some of these cross-cutting barriers and facilitators that we report on in the synthesis, which discuss some of the key mechanisms for increasing the likelihood that different types of programs will work. So it's not a matter, obviously, of just deploying police, but also how are those police trained and how do they interact with the community? Next slide, please. One other cross-cutting finding that we had, again, across types of programs and across performance and process and impact evaluations, is that institutionalizing the peace-building efforts can strengthen the sustainability. So peace-building efforts were both more sustainable and more impactful when they were embedded within laws, policies, and systemic institutional capacity, rather than implemented as standalone projects. I think this is something that we hear a lot in this field and other fields, but I would like to point out too that the reason that we found this is because there are also studies showing that programs are not doing this. So we found, again, this both ways, where some programs that weren't doing this were less successful. Programs that showed examples of these types of institutionalization approaches were more successful. So what do we mean by institutionalization? Across 9 studies that we saw that did this successfully, approaches included involving leadership and transition support, developing formal feedback mechanisms, and efforts to institutionalize processes over time, one of which was explicit planning for sustainability. So how can the initiatives embed activities into existing systems, foster local ownership, align with institutional priorities? Again, these are sort of buzz phrases that we hear a lot, but it was demonstrated again in both ways that you need to be able to do these for the programs to be successful. These findings also show the importance of early theorizing about who to engage, how and why there would be change from engaging those people, and what needs to continue to happen, happening to ensure that the programs are then sustainable and the people continue engaging them. Next slide, please. The final sort of cross-cutting finding that we'll present here is that inclusion, especially of women and youth, was often priorities, but evidence gaps remain. So many of the performance and process evaluations and some impact evaluations emphasize gender and youth inclusion, but few of them measured impact of gender and youth inclusion, and then also few of them examined participation of other types of vulnerable populations. So gender and youth are frequently featured in program design, but what we found throughout the studies and many of, especially the performance and process evaluations, included references to women and youth. So we found that the theory was more about inclusion and less about how the inclusion of women and youth then impacted violence, reduced violence outcomes. So there's an evidence gap on whether the initiatives that focus on increasing representation of women in the absence of complementary violence reduction efforts actually leads to reduction in violence. Yeah, so the implication of this would be that stronger theories have changed again, and more mixed methods and experimental evaluations are needed to understand how the inclusion is linked directly to reduction of conflict and violence. And just lastly, I'll add that few of the initiatives that, again, mentioned gender and youth as inclusion embedded the practical mechanisms to ensure that this engagement was sustained, inclusive, and would actually lead to differentiated outcomes. I'll stop there. I think pass it back to Isabel.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Andy. Very much appreciated for that interesting presentation. Of course, everyone, we do encourage you to look at the full report. That is, of course, even richer and deeper in its analysis. But thank you very much for those highlights. Now we get to hear from our panelists. So I'll pass the floor to Matthew Cogan. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And thank you so much to the team behind this of the SDG Synthesis group and to the organizers for this. It's a really impressive piece of work, and I think it's really impressive to see something that is both so rigorous in its analysis, but also so clearly communicated and accessible in how it's presented. So I'm going to try to make a fairly brief intervention. I'm going to focus on Ireland's position. Then I'll have a few reflections on the findings and implications of the study, and then conclude what my main takeaway is from it. So first of all, I can say that Ireland is very proud to support this study, not only because it's a policy priority for us to support peace building, but also because we see this as a demonstration of UN coordination, bringing together the diverse capacities and unique expertise of the UN agencies involved. I think is really seeing the unique value of the UN system. Ireland is committed to supporting multilateralism with the UN at its core. We also remain committed to the SDGs as a unique and vital platform for supporting a more sustainable and more just world. Ireland is committed to being a good faith actor in the world through its foreign policy in promoting peace and conflict resolution through an inclusive approach, really informed and rooted in the experience of conflict and peace building and sustaining peace on the island of Ireland. I think anything we talk about now in terms of international cooperation is really, we can't avoid the elephant in the room that ODA levels are really being cut extremely dramatically and causing a lot of pain to all of you. I don't think you need me to tell you about that. But we are in a new normal, and I think we shouldn't expect that things will go back to where they were only a few years ago. So that really gives a lot of pressure on us to do better with less. And I think having such a robust evidence base is very valuable for that, particularly in a field where, I think sometimes we can be a bit loose with language or loose in terms of the effectiveness of various interventions. This allows us to be a bit more pointed, a bit more focused. I think that it's very timely as well, as in 2026, the Peace Building Fund, which Ireland is a supporter of, is going through the development of a new strategy. Also, the World Bank is still in the process of refreshing its FCV strategy. So I think it's very timely, and we see complementarity between those two processes. But I think evidence alone is not enough. We know really that it's quite rare that evidence alone is the basis for decision making, either policy level or resource allocation level. So we need to make this political. I think the excellent work that's been done on communicating this is very helpful, but we need to keep on banging the drum on it and bring it up to political level, particularly in a world where political leaders and their attention is really focusing much more on a security-based approach to peace. I think those of us that are committed to peace building need to make the case that security alone will not bring peace, and we need to have more joint-up approaches, and peace building works. I'd like to welcome also the scope of this work, having such a broad scope, broad remit across so many countries, and a large number of impact evaluations and process evaluations. Really increases the robustness and the legitimacy of it. I think it's great also that they've acknowledged the limitations of that this is largely focused on Africa and Latin America evidence base. So to be honest, when I look at it and I think of the experience of conflict and peace building on the island of Ireland, really many of the same lessons are very relevant. I think of what you were talking earlier about policing, about militarized approaches to policing not working, about the importance of institutionalization. They very much resonate, and I suspect they will also will also resonate in other parts of the world, even if there wasn't such a strong coverage of the evaluations. I think the focus not only on what type of interventions work, but also how they're done was really welcome, and the strong focus of local ownership and rooting interventions in local structures is really important, particularly because the audience for this is largely international community actors, be they governments or NGOs or part of the UN system, so that we can always be minded that our role is limited, and again reflect on the history of conflict in the north of Ireland, where the international community had a very important role. The mediation of the US government, interventions by South Africa, Finnish political leaders, we really benefited from a lot. But ultimately, the peace really came from the bottom up, from the communities that were most affected and from the political leaders. So how the international community works and investing in local systems, local ownership and institutionalization is extremely important. I'd like to pick up on that point about inclusion and not seeing a relationship or a strong association between inclusive approaches and reducing conflict. I think that's okay, and we need to accept the facts as they come to us, whilst also acknowledging that the gap in evidence is not the same as evidence in a gap. Also, I don't think when we talk about human rights or inclusion issues, we shouldn't be too utilitarian when we talk about them. We don't only invest in human rights because it gives us benefits, either economic or other outputs and interventions. Human rights are human rights, and we should be supporting them no matter what. And that includes inclusion and participation in decisions that affect people's lives. I think it's probably also worth bearing in mind that inclusion, I suppose the questions of the evaluations where we're looking at reduction in conflict, reductions in conflict-related deaths, and probably the bigger benefits from inclusive approaches may come in sustaining peace, whilst the people in charge of violence or with guns, mostly men, can decide or not decide to continue fighting or to continue killing. Sustaining that peace requires an all society buy-in, and I think that's probably where you might see the greatest impact of inclusive approaches. WPS and YPS agendas are priorities for the Irish government, and we still believe that's still the right thing to do. So to conclude, I think a couple of things we should just take away. One is that peace building works, and we shouldn't forget that, particularly when this peace building community has really been bashed quite badly and hit by funding cuts, and I think politically challenged significantly over the last 2 years. So let's not forget that, and let's repeat that and use the evidence we have. I think this also shows us the value of having a layered, context-specific, politically informed approach that is rooted in national structures. Really reaffirms that the famous Kofi Annan quote of no peace without development, no development without peace, and no lasting peace without or sustainable development without respect for human rights and rule of law. And I think this study really bears that out. So thanks again, and that's all from me.
Thank you so much for your reflections on the report, and of course for sharing your insights on Ireland and your perspectives there, and of course this space of peace building and peace work. I wanted to mention to everyone we do have a Q&A option here on your screen. You feel free to start using it to put some reflections and comments. We will turn to you in the Q&A after we've finished hearing from our wonderful speakers. So feel free to use that function. I will now pass over the floor to Fatouja. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here today on behalf of IOM. The synthesis has been launched at a very critical time, as colleagues have already mentioned. We are seeing this coming out during a time where we see rising displacement numbers. We have unprecedented levels of protracted conflict and violent situations. And of course, we also know that resources are dwindling where grievances still remain. So just speaking to some of the different areas and wanting to kind of pinpoint where IOM has been contributing. So in looking at particularly the work of IOM, we cut across the mobility spectrum. IOM is a triple mandated organization, meaning we work across the humanitarian peace and development efforts, bringing our work together to really support efforts on the ground. So speaking to some of the key areas that we have seen, we know that at the current moment, we have over 83 million as of the latest IDMC data from 2024 in terms of the number of people displaced. So in terms of our efforts, it's very important that we consider, as already mentioned on the call, a more holistic approach. Going back to the first key areas that was very compelling that came out of the synthesis is how economic opportunities are vital to transition processes and solutions as well. We know that in terms of really supporting peace building efforts, employment opportunities and livelihoods are really integral and key. Speaking more to this, I want to highlight some of the work that IOM has been doing in this area, taking example to what we call our Enterprise Development Fund, which really looks at grant mechanisms to small and medium-sized businesses to really support job creation, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected contexts as well. An example of this is some of the work that we have done in Iraq, where we have supported various businesses following the conflict situation there to basically support reintegration efforts, and both looking at from a small to medium-sized enterprise level, but also how we're supporting individual livelihood related areas as well. This includes supporting income generation activities and job creation. And a lot of this has also linked to the work that we are doing to support the 4.9 million returnees in Iraq, as well as the 1.1 million that still remain displaced. And we see that the work that we have been doing on livelihoods has been a very important part to the peace building related processes and the factors of supporting the DDR programs as well. Sorry, I'm having a lot of messages coming in. Some of the other areas, just a lot of people trying to enter into the call. Just some of the other areas that I'd like to speak to as well goes back to the point around local ownership and community inclusivity. We saw that in the synthesis, it showcased a lot of the importance of community engagement. And I'd like to take this moment to also speak to IOM's community-based planning approach that we have really used as an instrument in the way that we support peace processes. The community-based planning approach looks at how we are really understand the community priorities and putting communities at the center of deciding where we need to intervene to really support community resilience building and development areas as well. From this community-based planning process, we understand what are the key areas that we need to intervene in. So it is a comprehensive approach that looks at both assessment and planning processes, but at the same time, the community remains involved with the implementation as well. I'd like to also take this opportunity to highlight how we have also brought this into our DDR-related tools and instruments. In the Lake Chad Basin, where IOM has been very active for some time, looking at the management of return and reintegration of former associates of violent extremist organizations, IOM has put in place a 4-pillar approach linked to DDR-related tools that we call disengagement, disassociation, reintegration, and reconciliation. This is a comprehensive model that looks to both engage at the individual and community level, supporting both states and peace-related processes as well to ensure that when we are looking at reintegration is multifold and multi-leveled as well. In this whole DDR-related model that IOM has put in place, we do contextualize to the national context as well, meaning we do engage very closely to understand how we can shape the framework that has been developed to speak to the local realities and sensitivities as well. Recently, there has been an evaluation that was conducted on our DDRR-related portfolio, and what we found in Niger and in Chad is that for Chad, 86% of those who were interviewed, and for Niger, 69% that said that the work of IOM as related to the DDR operations that were implemented, they did see a reduction of violence within those areas. So we are happy to say that yes, there is evidence that has shown the impact of the work on the ground. And this then brings me to our third point, and I think this goes back to a lot of what has been said on the call already in terms of the importance of evidence in really understanding what has been the impact in terms of how all that we are doing really supports building efforts and processes. This also goes back to how we are focusing more around the impact rather than a heightened attention on implementation, and how can this go hand in hand so we are further developing and strengthening a theory of change around peace building interventions as well. So these are some of the main areas that we have been looking at, and happy to pass it back over to you, and also looking forward to any questions that I'd be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fetu, for sharing IOM's work and perspective. I'll pass the floor to Anna Yancy. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Isabel, and thanks to the team for this timely and important report, and most of it for bringing us together to reflect on its key findings from our different perspectives. I think it's going to be really useful, at least from the perspective of UN peacekeeping. It was very interesting to read the report. Let me start with a seemingly simple point that the report makes very clearly, and that it is central from a UN peacekeeping perspective. And that's the point about reducing violence, including conflict-related deaths, is not the result of any single intervention, right? It depends on how a system works, the system works. And the report points to 3 mutually reinforcing lanes: the strengthening social cohesion and conflict resolution, creating safer environments, and supporting peace processes, of course. But from the perspective of UN peacekeeping, even though we fall into the category of peace interventions, our missions work every day on the 3 lanes: by protecting people from immediate threat, by reducing escalation of risks, and by creating the space for political solutions. So that division that is often made in people's minds, that peacekeeping operations are different from peace building. In our view, UN peacekeeping missions are and should be peace building tools, right? That's where when they are most effective, if they take on that role as well as an integral part of what they do. The report also makes it very clear that presence alone is not enough. What matters is whether efforts are aligned with local needs and made sustainable through institutionalization and partnerships that build legitimacy over time. So I want to focus my intervention in making 3 points through 3 different lenses from UN peacekeeping. One is the work of civil affairs, one is on policing, and the last one is on protection of civilians. And then, if you'll allow me, I will close with a more practical so what. So from the perspective of civil affairs work on the ground might be one of the less visible parts of peacekeeping, but it really saves lives. We have seen repeatedly that conflict-related deaths are not driven only by direct conflict violence. They also stem from localized disputes that escalate when the mechanisms that should manage tensions are weak. So this is why the work of civil affairs is so central to prevention. Civil affairs components in peacekeeping missions, which, by the way, remains the largest civilian component in the field, is about creating credible local platforms for dialogue and supporting inclusive mediation and problem solving, and also sustaining mechanisms for local conflict management over time. And here is a point that sounds simple, but really is decisive. Continuity is the delivery mechanism. Community liaison, assistants, and national colleagues in peacekeeping missions are often the difference between hearing a warning and understanding it in time to act. The report also signals a clear risk when interventions bypass legitimate local structures rather than engaging them. The impact is often weaker and less sustainable. And this is something that I think we really need to take in and understand. When context is poorly understood, interventions, instead of helping, can even heighten tensions. And we see this in our field work all the time. And we make efforts to try to address that proactively. In ABA, for example, our mission UNESFA supports dialogue forums, community-based monitoring, and locally negotiated migration corridors. And that has helped reduce predictable flashpoints linked to seasonal movement and land access. In MINUSCA in Bangassou, the support to local dialogue structures and reconciliation after intercommunal violence has contributed to gradual restoration of coexistence and local stabilization. And with MONUSCO support in Ituri, support to land-related dialogue and mediation shows both the preventive value and its limits. Local engagement can reduce immediate risk, but durability and sustainability really depend on wider political and governance solution. That is why this work must always be connected to the mission-wide political engagement and the mission's political strategy. So point 1 is simple, right? Prevention works best when it's locally anchored, when it's inclusive, when it's sustained, and when we link it to the mission's political work. Moving on to the police work we do on the ground. The report places policing within the safe environments lane and delivers a message that is highly relevant for DPO. Expanded policing can reduce violence in some settings, but right-based approaches and accountability are central to sustaining gains. It is also explicit about risk, right? Militarized policing approaches are associated with negative, unintended consequences, including potential human rights violations, and show limited evidence of effectiveness. For UN operations, this matters because legitimacy is the operational currency. When policing is experienced as abusive or unaccountable, it can deepen grievances and undermine trust. The report also very usefully notes that evidence on community policing remains mixed, right? At the same time, it notes that these approaches are often well received and can improve perceptions of safety and police community trust, especially in high conflict areas with limited formal policing. So for us, for peacekeeping and for the practice of UNPOL, there are three very practical points. First, that regular interaction between communities, national police services, and UNPOL does build confidence, and it strengthens community ownership of safety initiatives, and that one is key. The other one, equally important, is that training has to stick, right? It needs supervision, it needs follow-through, and clear performance expectations, not only training in isolation. And the third one is that oversight and accountability are simply not optional, right? They are the condition for success, especially where there is a history of abuse. And in most of our host countries, that is the case. The third point that I want to make is on protection of civilians. A reality that we always acknowledge is that peacekeeping is not a substitute for the host state's primary responsibility, and missions cannot protect everyone everywhere at all times. However, DPIO's experience is that peacekeeping has protected and continues to protect people from violence and harm through increasingly integrated civilian, military, and police approaches. Operationally, POC often comes down to one thing, really, and it's early warning with timely response. The point to stress this is quite straightforward, right? Early warning approaches have advanced, but the persistent challenge for us remains translating those alerts into responses that are quick in environments where we have so many logistical and resource constraints, as well as restrictions imposed by both state and non-state actors. So the DPO takeaway on this is very practical. We need to keep early warning human anchored. And for that, community links and community liaison assistance remain essential sources and interpreters of risk information. The second point is that to build the response pathway upfront is not optional. If the chain from information to decision to deployment is unclear or under resources, early warning loses its protective value, right? It has to be connected and it has to be well thought through from the beginning. And the third point is that balanced, alert-based, and structural early warning is needed by missions. Absolutely. It has to be balanced and it has to be structured early warning response. Let me end my intervention with what this means in practice for UN peacekeeping. The report is not saying there is one silver bullet. It's saying violence reduction works well when all the pieces connect, and we absolutely agree with that. What helps is very clear: institutionalization, local ownership, and partnerships that make interventions legitimate and durable. And the report is concrete on that. When efforts are anchored in laws and protocols and local systems, and when communities are real partners in the design and the implementation, the results are more likely to last. And that's what we all should be working towards. But the report is just as clear on what gets in the way, and we should also say that very plainly. Programs usually fall short when the context is poorly understood, when the initiatives are fragmented or poorly coordinated, and when goals are too ambitious for the time and resources available, when we do not plan for political shocks and disruption. For peace operations, this is a very familiar picture. We see every day that effectiveness depends on whether we understand the local power dynamics, whether the mission is internally coherent and well integrated with the rest of the UN presence on the ground, and whether early warning is connected to a response pathway that is actually usable and that can be quick. The report also pushes a question that we should never treat as secondary, and it's who benefits, who is protected, and who is still being left out. From the DPO perspective, that is an effectiveness test. It means asking in practice who gets access to dialogue, whose warnings are believed, who can safely report threats, and whether our responses reach those at higher risk. So maybe if I had to summarize DPO's takeaway in one point, it would be that reducing conflict-related deaths requires combining protection, trusted policing support, and local political engagement, and doing so in a way that is coherent, inclusive, and grounded in legitimate institutions. And finally, let me close by saying that we should measure what matters. So just conflict deaths, but also the leading indicators that tell us whether prevention capacity is getting stronger or weaker. Apologies. So sorry about that. So trust, social cohesion, and whether early warning leads to response, and whether interventions are reaching those most at risk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for drawing those connection points between the findings of the report and the realities of broader peacekeeping work on the ground. Very interesting intervention. And finally, I'll pass the floor to Brian James Williams, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Go ahead, Brian.
Great. Thank you so much, Isabel and colleagues. Wonderful to be with all of you today. Really appreciated all my previous speakers, and I endorse everything that they've said. They said a lot of wonderful things. This report is super important, and the whole initiative of the synthesis review is super important. I think it's particularly important for the peace pillar. All the SDGs and tracking evidence is important, but there's a couple of reasons why the peace pillar, I think, particularly deserves this attention. The first is there's such a strong element of prevention in the peace pillar, about conflict prevention, about violence prevention. And we all know the challenges around demonstrating how prevention is effective and is impactful. And that is a good motivation for us to do more research. Secondly, in the peace work that we do, in the peace building work that we do, we know that there's so many factors that influence a conflict. And there are often very high-level political factors, sometimes national, sometimes international, that affect the environments. And I think sometimes our interlocutors, the politicians, even the casual observer, kind of thinks, you know, these community interventions that you're doing, what's the point of doing that when there's bigger forces at play that are really what's driving the environment? And I think, as some of the previous speakers have said, often it's small conflicts that get instrumentalized, that can trigger larger conflicts, but this is not always intuitive. And so I think having the evidence of the synthesis is really, really important. So congratulations for this work, and it's really a pleasure to be here. On the Peace Building Fund side, we take all of this work around learning, evaluation, monitoring really very seriously. We have a small but very powerful team that is working on all of this. Every project that we do gets an independent evaluation. We do multi-year portfolio evaluations. We do synthesis reviews of our own. We do thematic evaluations, which are trying to do learning from different themes. So we take all of this super seriously, and glad to be a part of this initiative. We're thrilled, though, that your initiative is taking learnings like from us, but also from all the other partners, and maximizing and amplifying and getting the word out there, because it really is very important that we're undertaking this advocacy. Let me make 4 or maybe 5 points that are raised by the report but which really resonate with us. The first is the importance of joint programming and integrated approaches. Some other colleagues have mentioned this, but we want to be kind of working with communities at all angles. So it's about the dialogue bits, but it's also about the socioeconomic bits, but it's also about the empowerments and human rights bits. One of our impact evaluations that was done in East Darfur demonstrated that when you do this kind of joint programming, multiple initiatives at the same time, you can really see some verifiable results. For example, in the region at the time period that the programs were undertaken, there was one fewer conflict for every 14 households as a result of this sort of combined approach. Interestingly, school-aged girls were 15% more likely to end up going to school as a result of and this was a proper experimental impact evaluation as a result of sort of these combined efforts. So joint programming, really working hard on reaching out to other partners that are engaging in this, really very important. Second point is the importance of local ownership. Again, something that has been mentioned by some of our previous colleagues. But in our own synthesis evaluation, one of its most critical findings was that local ownership was the key to sustainability. So however long your intervention might be, the way for those interventions and practices and behaviors that are getting put in place, the way for those to be sustainable through time is through local ownership, and is something that we work on as the Peace Building Fund through the UN system. But there's a lot of ways to engage with civil society. It's not just about how much money might end up in the hands of civil society. It's also about how they're engaged from the beginning. So in the analytical stages, in the strategy stages, and it's not just civil society, it's also those local governments, but it's that local ownership that is really very key. Third point, and again, this has been raised by some of my other speakers, is around the livelihoods and employment component. Really happy to see that this was directly addressed in the report. This is something that is often a cause for much discussion in our work with the Peace Building Fund. Our partners at country level are often strongly advocating for more work in employment and livelihood creation. At the same time, some of our development partners, our donors, start to say, gosh, this looks like regular development work. So, is this really something that the Peace Building Fund should be working in? And I think having addressed this issue in the synthesis report is particularly important. We need to be very specific and careful in our explanations and justifications for programs that we do about why employment of particular groups of people or particular communities is responding to grievances or historical marginalization or other issues that can be a driver of conflict. So really happy to see the livelihoods and employment piece in there. And I think it's something that everybody on this call should be picking up on and using in their own arguments. Number four, media and communication initiatives. Fantastic to see this also in the report. I think this is something that we don't do nearly enough of across the board. We know that in behavior change work across other disciplines, particularly in the public health sphere, for example, that communications and media is so tremendously important. And I think we should be open-minded. We have a lot to learn from the public health field because they've done a lot of work over the decades around how do prevention activities result in real behavior change and real impact. They have it maybe a little bit easier sometimes to measure incidence of diseases or not, but I think there's a lot that we can learn from the public health realm, and this includes in the area of communication, behavior change communication, and media work, and of course in today's world, social media is so tremendously important that we need to all engage in that much further. From the Peace Building Fund side, we will be looking, we were doing an impact evaluation ourselves that's looking at some activities in the Mali-Niger border region. So be on the lookout later this year for some of the results from that. We hope to get some learning from that. Fifth, I wanted to come back to this question around inclusion that has come up earlier in the conversation today of women and of youth. I think if there's one thing the Peace Building Fund is really proud of, well, we're proud of many things, but one of them is our insistence on conflict analysis. And I think let's remember, as the community of peace builders, where this impetus for inclusion comes from. It is, of course, tremendously important to get women more involved across the spectrum of peace building activities. And of course, it's important for youth as well. But inclusion is also about what conflict analysis says about conflict drivers. So what communities in a particular setting have been forced out, who don't have access to power, who are not involved in community governance, who don't feel that their rights are protected or they have access to justice? I mean, if you go back to some, well, the decades of research work around peace building, it's this exclusion from governance and from power sharing and from access to justice and to other services that is so important. And that's not just about women and about youth. That might, careful about what you might want to say, but in different settings, it's about particular provinces or particular regions or particular religions or particular ethnic groupings. And I think sometimes we shy away from that in our programming because it's more political and it's more complicated. And yet that's what's really driving many of these conflicts. So I think, we want to be a little bit more aggressive, if I can use that word, about inclusion. And yes, we need more evidence and more push on women and youth, but it's about more than that. Time to wrap up here. Good news is the evidence base is growing. Fantastic work again on this whole program. The challenge is how to really use this. And I think I'm sitting in New York City, which is known for real estate, and they say, location, location, location. I'm going to use a different phrase, and I'm going to say advocate, advocate, advocate. So a little hard to tell who exactly is on this call. I don't know if we have donors or if we have implementing partners, but all of you, we need to be using this to advocate more. We need to advocate locally with governments about the importance of conflict prevention, and there's the Pact for the Future and National Prevention Strategies. We got some good lines there, and let's use this evidence to back it up. We want to get representatives of international organizations at local level to be doing more advocacy back to their capitals, because we know the global trend at the moment is towards securitization, a security approach, more military spending and all the rest. We need the representatives of decision makers in capital cities to hear from their representatives on the ground that we need to be doing community-based sustainable peace building work. And we need to be advocating to those ambassadors and so on at the ground to get that message back. And of course, we need to be advocating internally to our own programming partners about all the lessons that this report is yielding to us. So fantastic news. Congratulations again. Looking forward to the discussion. And please, everybody, write down on your to-do lists as a result of today's meeting who the 5 people you are going to be that you're going to go advocate this with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian, for that homework. I think it's great. I'm a big fan of using evidence to advocate for what we know is good and right. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A, which will be managed by Shiv Bakrania. Shiv, a wonderful member of my team, certainly part, if not almost all of the beating heart of the coalition, and who co-managed the Peace Pillar Synthesis Management Group. And Shiv will manage the Q&A. So I'll pass over to you, Shiv.
Thanks, Isabel. So we have a number of comments and questions in the Q&A. So thanks to all of those who have posted. So I'm going to bring up the first one from Ruth Simpson, and this is about the gap in evidence about gender and inclusion. And she's asking whether this gap exists because the links don't exist, or are they more about how programs are designed and monitored? For example, are we simply not asking the right questions at the right time, or including a wide enough range of perspectives to properly understand how inclusion relates to violence outcomes? So this is related to the key finding that Andy has already spoken about. Perhaps, Andy, I'll hand it over to you first, and if other panelists have any comments on that, they can come in.
Yeah, sounds great. And I recognize too that there was a lot of engagement from the panelists on this question. Ruth, I think the way that you phrased it is exactly the case. So at this point, both on the programmatic side and on the evaluation side, programs are engaging, let's particularly talk about women and youth right now, programs are engaging women and youth because it is an expectation. And then evaluations are looking at the engagement of women and youth because it is an evaluation. So it is sort of a checkbox in outputs if you're thinking about a theory of change. So we have an input, which is engaging women and youth, and the output, which is were women and youth engaged? The answer is yes. And that's typically where evaluations stop measuring what effects that might have had. So they were engaged, part of the program, but it's almost a missed opportunity in saying, where can they further enhance the program by engaging in some way to reduce violence and to enhance the programming that's being offered. So essentially, both in programs as well as in program evaluation, there's that missing link of we need to look at, first of all, how can we engage women and youth and other marginalized populations in a way that enhances the goals of the ultimate goals of the program or the outcomes? And then how do we measure it to ensure that we're demonstrating how effective, theorized how effective that is? Because I think from what all of our panelists said, it is likely to be very effective for reduction of violence to engage particularly women and youth. And then just the second quick point on the other marginalized populations, Brian, what you just said, absolutely. The challenge with both programming and evaluation is people are not mentioning these groups or thinking about how to engage the groups to lead to the end outcome goal of violence reduction for the particular context. So what we found, particularly in the 75 performance and process evaluations, none of those, for example, mentioned persons with disabilities. There was some engagement of more rural communities or more marginalized communities, but it was certainly not a focus in the same way of gender and youth in terms of how can engaging those types of communities further that goal.
Thanks, Andy. So I hope, Ruth, that's a good answer to your question there. Do any of the other panelists have any other comments on that? Not to put you on the spot, but just wanted to give you an opportunity to come in if you wanted to. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question. Okay.
I mean, just to say, sorry, I will jump in very quickly. I mean, just to say, as in other aspects related to gender equality and women's empowerment, you know, the world doesn't turn to that often enough. So we do have what we call gender marker 3 specific programs where they're specifically focused on women's empowerment. But I think we all need to be advocating and spending more resources, frankly, to look at this particular issue, because it just, you know, it's not the thing that governments and partners tend to turn to first, and that's a problem.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, so we have another question that was posted by Rafael Velasquez. And again, maybe this is for the authors, Andy and Thomas. And you spoke in your presentation about some of the previous evidence that came before this synthesis, in particular the 3AE evidence gap maps, which were used as part of the process of putting the synthesis together. And the question is, how do the findings compare with those gap maps? And do you see any significant differences in the findings? Maybe we should preface this by saying that, you know, the gap map in and of itself won't have answered any of the synthesis questions, but there may have been some developments or involvements in the spread of evidence across this SDG.
I can speak a little. Yeah, I can speak a little bit towards that. I wanted to indeed mention, like, the previous evidence gap maps are not necessarily focusing on like what does the evidence say, but more about what evidence exists, and we addressed that question as well. The other key piece here, which makes it a bit hard to compare, is that the 3IE evidence gap maps had a much broader focus. So where we purposely like excluded some specific interventions to keep the scope manageable, the 3IE evidence gap map very purposely also like went very broad and like essentially like took on everything that exists in this space, probably because it was also like an evidence gap map, which makes it more feasible to do that relative to an evidence synthesis, to take on that large scope. I did want to like maybe also like mention one thing that I think is very similar still between the 3IE evidence gap map and our own evidence synthesis. And this responds to one of the points that Matthew made about like reductions in overseas development assistance, which is like ultimately what our report shows. We see that various interventions are effective, various interventions are less effective. What is completely missing from the evidence, and that remains a challenge, both in the 3IE evidence gap maps and our own evidence synthesis, is any evidence on cost effectiveness. At this point in time, we basically have zero knowledge about the cost effectiveness of these interventions, even if we know the effectiveness of these interventions in a time where overseas development assistance is rapidly decreasing. That's a real big gap, because we don't know at this point for limited dollars how much we can do in terms of like saving lives, and like it becomes increasingly important to actually like increase the evidence on cost effectiveness of these interventions.
Thanks, Thomas. I'll move on to the next question, and this is by Kai Brand Jakobsen. And this is about how we use the evidence. So it's all very well, to spend time on producing the synthesis and then launching it at an event like this. But what are we doing? What steps are we taking to make sure that the evidence and the synthesis and other work, other similar work, is actually used throughout the UN and multilateral system and within communities of practice and with donors internationally, and is also putting an effort to help? I might just say a little bit about this before I hand it over, and perhaps all the other panelists can, you're all from different parts of the UN system. Maybe you have some comments on how you might use the findings from the synthesis in your own work, and what you can do to help advocate, as Brian mentioned in his talk. But the ambition is for these reports not to be static PDF reports. So we're moving towards a situation where we want these syntheses to be living, to be interactive. For example, this synthesis in itself, it covers a wide scope of initiatives and outcome types. And hopefully in a year or two, we're in a situation where, the evidence from these reports is put out there, so decision makers can cut into the synthesis and cut it any which way they want. So if there's a subsample of the evidence on a specific intervention or from a specific context, they can draw out the evidence on that specific area of interest. So that's one thing we're doing. And the other thing we're doing at the coalition going forward is really ramping up our work on kind of demand side within the UN system. So we have plans in place to improve this. We haven't done enough yet, but hopefully we can get better at doing that through the plans we have in place. I just wanted to hand it over to the panel and see if you have any comments on thoughts you might have from your end on how we can actually sort of action some of these lessons from the synthesis.
I mean, maybe I'll go quickly, Shiv, and if my voice allows me without my lungs coming out. But I just wanted to say that for peacekeeping, it has always been a bit of a challenge to work around evidence, because we are so reactive by nature and so operationally driven, that it has taken us a long time to understand that we need to get better at it. And any effort that points to the things that we know from practice, to something that gives evidence about it, is very useful for us to move forward. And I think this report does that very well, and it's a very useful tool for peacekeeping to continue to advocate and to show the impact that we have on the ground, and why there is a logic behind it, right? That there's evidence proving all of these things, instead of we just say it because we're there and we see it and we say it. So I think we have been making efforts to move towards a more evidence-based performance and communications when it comes to peacekeeping. We have, for the past few years, been developing a tool. It's called the CPAS. Some of you may have heard of it, which is the comprehensive planning tool for peacekeeping. And it's basically that, right? It's trying to measure impact and trying to make our decisions evidence-based and plan our decision-making on that evidence. So for us, this report is one extra tool that we can use for advocacy and to change the mindset and the culture too, because that's an important piece of it, right? It needs for leaders to start thinking about it differently and to start seeing evidence and measuring and evaluation as a tool to be more effective and more impactful. So for us, that is crucial. So thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Any other comments from the panel, or shall we move on? I know I'm putting you on the spot here.
If I may, yeah, just
Please.
I think for those of us that have access, I think it's just trying to keep peace building on the political agenda. In a space that's very dominated by security and defense, making the argument, banging the drum that peace building is an important part of a coherent approach to security. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Maybe this is the last one we'll have time for today, but it's a comment from Megan from OECD DAC, and a very important question, actually, that challenges us. So Megan's asking why in this synthesis we focus on low and middle income countries only. The SDGs have a very important underlying principle of universality, right? Which is a fundamental part of the SDGs. So, you know, given that we focused on low middle income countries, is the distinction of income level meaningful when looking at evidence about what works and where? And perhaps I might just come in on this myself to say that it's never been a policy of the coalition to only focus on low and middle income countries. We have debated, you know, every time we do a synthesis, this issue of universality before, but perhaps there were some considerations here in terms of the feasibility of doing the synthesis and the scope, and also thinking about kind of generalization and contextualization and how we can kind of generalize those lessons to other kind of similar contexts. So I'll leave it there and maybe pass to Thomas and Andy as well, who might have some thoughts on this.
I'm happy to jump in here. Like if you look at the evidence on high income countries from a technical perspective, search strings that you develop for databases for systematic reviews, the evidence that you will find will increase exponentially. When we're talking about previously having to screen 10,000 studies, I can only speculate how much that would be when we include high-income countries, but I would not be surprised if it would become 50,000 rather than 10,000. So the scope of the number of screenings that we would have to do as part of the synthesis would increase exponentially. And ultimately, this is a matter of resource constraints. There's absolutely no reason that we wouldn't want to include high-income countries, but just like overseas development assistance is reducing, like we also only have limited resources to conduct these evidence synthesis, so that makes it hard to include high-income countries given the amount of evidence that is generally available.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah. So I think that's all of the comments covered that we have in the Q&A function. I'm going to hand back over to Isabel for the final flourish.
Final flourish. Okay. Before you all sign off online and panelists, I do have a question. It's a little bit related to what Kai posted. We in evaluation are really interested in people using our work. And I think people use our work when it responds to a need. So the work of the coalition is ongoing. There is work that will continue on the peace pillar. I'm curious to hear from you. Perhaps put it in the Q&A and from our panelists, what would you like to see happen next? What is the next peace pillar synthesis report you'd like to be talking about and reading in the next months, in the next years. I'm going to put people on the spot. I will start with, I won't start with Anna Yancey because she's struggling. Brian, I'll start with you.
All right, thanks a lot. I just wanted to say, in terms of using this, of course, the resident coordinator system and country teams is a logical place for us. So we will be, communicating all of this back, and it'll affect our decision making directly. So, it will be used. I'd love to see something that gets at justice, human rights, rule of law.
Thank you. Fatou.
I think that's probably similar to what I was thinking as well. I think I'd also like to see a bit more in terms of the good governance piece as well, and how that can also support some of the efforts. Thank you.
Thanks. Matthew.
I think speaking to the point on inclusion that I made earlier, it would be on SDG 5, so gender equality and empowerment of women and girls.
Wonderful. Anna Yancey.
Thank you so much. Seconding Brian's focus on rule of law, that would be great. Human rights for us is quite important, so a deep dive on that would be really useful. And I would say this report itself, I think I will certainly use it and report back to DPO leadership so that we can start moving more towards giving its due importance to evaluation and measuring our impact and trying to benefit from that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, panelists, for your attention. Thank you, participants, for listening. Please do champion this. Please do mention it, share it with your colleagues. We have a link here, I believe, that will bring you to the reports. Very much appreciate your time. And thank you. We'll bring this to a close. Take care, everyone.